Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Unicorn Lightning webinar today. My name is Kelly Simmons, Data Coordinator. I just wanted to use the time today really to go over some important components of our upcoming billing enhancement. I know it's a lot to take in, and so I thought we could walk through some of the major release components and go through. Basically, I kind of color coded. I'm going to share my screen if I can share correctly here. Okay. I just basically color coded the different elements for, as it was laid out in the communication that Amanda put together, for whether or not there's any action on your part, whether it's mandatory, a requirement, or something that's optional, or whether there's no action at all, just informational. And before I go through that, I did want to say too that the revised, to the point that it is revised now, there's still lots of revisions to go into this, especially with the billing enhancement, but the user guide is now, should be available on the EI Colorado website, the updated version that has all of the screenshots and the information and the verbiage reflective of Lightning. And then, as I stated in the previous webinar, I will be including those links to videos that will be the walkthroughs for different elements throughout the user guide. And then as we get closer to our rollout of the billing enhancement, that user guide is going to have to be updated to include all of that important information as well. But I did want to point that out. And then at the end, I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions. I know it's reading through notes can be tedious and a little more difficult, so I want to be able to have some interactive time at the end if you do have questions about the billing enhancement. Okay, hopefully you're seeing it now. So let's just delve in, and I believe that Amanda is on the line as well and will be available at the end to help answer any questions. So the first component has to do with the provider portal and service provider visit tracking. And basically, this is a redesign of the billing system in Unicorn, and it is an entirely new feature, and it will allow service providers to enter billing in the provider portal. CCBs do have the option of continuing to enter billing following the existing process of creating utilizations and activities, but the update would allow an active service provider contracted with a CCB to enter units of service via a customized calendar in the provider portal. And that would be for all client sessions and associated services. This update is, again, intended to minimize the administrative burden of entering billing in Unicorn. We know how much hard work goes into this area. Creating the ability for service providers to enter their own billing is expected, hopefully, to decrease billing errors, and increase the transparency and accountability as well. So this particular update is, again, labeled as not unless desired. So basically, it's an optional for CCBs to participate should you choose. Now, the CCB rate table, those things labeled green for go would be an indication of yes for things, action on your part. And this update adds a feature in which CCBs are able to specify service provider rates into a rate table to align with service provider contracted rates for the current fiscal year. The CCB rate table will include all service catalogs and automatically populates rates when entering billing. So the CCBs will need to review rates in the rate table for all EI allowable session and transaction services, and EI Colorado will populate the rate table from all CCB budgets submitted and approved for the fiscal year 18-19. So again, this will be starting in this next upcoming fiscal year. The rate table will be updated at the beginning of each fiscal year and then must align with CCB approved budgets. So this is a new feature as part of the billing enhancement update. The service provider assignment. This is also something that will require action on your part. This update is to improve the process of adding a service provider assigned to a service on an IFSP and on a client case. And as listed in the communication, it will address multiple issues, and I'll just go through these 4 highlighted areas. Historical record of all service providers on a service plan element, addition of a temporary service provider to a service plan element in the case that a service provider had to go on maternity or paternity leave or was sick or an extended leave, and this would be able to track those additional providers. Provider assignment to an EI screening, such as an eval or an initial IFSP, in which this is a one-time situation and not ongoing services. And then also billing parameters bound to service provider consent date and end date, because these will be tracked as well. So the action part would be users will now need to add service providers via the new related list called service provider assignment, rather than adding the service provider on the service plan element in the service provider field. And again, this is a new element that will be rolled out with the billing enhancement, and it is labeled green because this will require some action on your part. Moving on to the service plan element, that includes updates to start and end dates. So this update is to ensure projected start date, end date, consent date, and actual start dates correctly populate on the service plan element associated with the service provider. And the 2 things that this will help ensure is both accurate population of end date for services continued at a periodic or annual review, and also accurate population of consent date and actual start date for those continued services at a periodic or annual review. So your part in this would be that users will now enter actual start dates and end dates on the service provider agreement on the service plan element and or on the client case. So it just has to do with the place where this information will be entered. And I'm going to pause for a moment to also say that more detailed information is going to be coming regarding demos and training. And in addition to the updated user guide, we want to make sure that we're able to provide sufficient training to walk through all these different components and elements. So I did want to just pause for a second to point that out, because I know that it's a lot of information to take in. The next area is labeled, I have it labeled orange for the not unless desired, so it's an optional. And that is the activity creation standardization with transactions and session services. And this update will basically streamline billing for session and transaction services that are associated with service providers added to that service plan element. Currently, session and transaction services are created in separate areas of the unicorn, and that is the service plan element, those are the session services, or the client case, those are transaction services. So if a service provider is assigned to a service on an IFSP and associated with a service plan element, all activities, session and transaction, will be created from the service plan element. A session service is required in order to bill any additional transaction services, such as EI physical therapy session activity is created, and then EI travel activity is created, and then EI mileage activity is created. So CCBs who do elect to allow service providers to enter billing in the provider portal will have the ability to create EI services from the client cases calendar, and activities will automatically generate associated with the service plan element on the client case. So again, this is an optional piece if you choose to participate in that, just to help streamline your work. Another optional piece is the customized activity approval screen. And this is a creation of a new customized billing approval screen to provide an alternative to utilizing Salesforce Lightning Activities List View to mass update activity status to ready for invoicing prior to the third month batch invoicing. Again, you'll have the option of utilizing a custom approval screen to review activities and update the activity status. It's not a requirement if you choose to continue to use List View in your current process. A new activity status is another optional feature, and the new status of approved has been added to the pick list options to the activity field status. And this has basically been created to align with the service provider billing in the provider portal, in which a CCB will review automatically generated utilizations and activities rather than creating activities in Unicorn. So once those are reviewed, they can be put into a status of approved. CCBs have the option of continuing to enter billing following existing processes, again, with creating utilizations and activities in Unicorns, but they will also now have this option of allowing service providers to enter billing in the provider portal. And so that's where the approved added field comes into play. And the permission set with billing approval. This is something that will require action on your part. This update is creating a new user permission, which will grant access to a user to update the activity status to ready for invoicing. If the user does not have this permission, then the user will be restricted from updating the activity status to ready for invoicing. So whatever authorized CCB designated user, such as an EI coordinator who's assigned, they will need to contact EI Colorado to request permission for an individual user to be granted the permission set to update activity status to ready for invoicing. Again, this is all part of the billing enhancement that is going to hopefully be rolled out then next month. And then finally, allowable units per session and the reason over allowable units. This is not anything that requires action on your part, but this update was rather implemented as a way of setting parameters for the service provider, entering units on the client case calendar in the provider portal. So for those TCBs that choose to utilize that feature, this is something that was entered or included in order to better track the units that are entered by a service provider. An automatic update, again, to the creation of activities on the client case calendar in the provider portal. So that was a really quick run through of the different components. And again, because it is so much information rolling out at once, I thought it would be good to kind of go over it and see it in this view, and then give you a chance to ask any questions or clarifications. It is something that we realize is going to require a lot of additional supporting documentation and training. And so I do want to just again reiterate that we will be sending out communication, making sure that you have plenty of advance notice as to when those trainings are going to be and how they're going to be conducted. I am going to see if I can pull up my chat, but I know I have a couple coworkers monitoring as well. You can, again, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question audibly. Okay, what questions do you have? What is the date for the training and when will these changes be implemented? So we will send out communication probably by the end of this week with those dates, simply because we need to reconvene just to have a really clear picture for the testing and release date. But we want to be able to start walking through some of this prior to the release and then again after the release. But it will be next month in June. And then the documentation will be also updated, the user guide and any supporting documentation simultaneously. So I don't have a hard date for you, but I wanted to at least give you guys a heads up that that is coming. And I'll give you those dates by the end of the week. The updates show provider portal service provider visit tracking. Does this mean Unicorn will now track the 45 visits? Amanda, would you be able to answer that one?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Awesome. Nope. That actually the definition of what we're calling service provider visit tracking is to align with session services. So those that they are providing a direct service to a client, not necessarily tracking the 45 visits related to the Early Intervention Services Trust. So that's something that we're hoping to address in the future in a future release. So, yep, I think the definition for that is a little bit different than what you were asking.
And DDRC is asking, or stating and then asking, it would be helpful to start off the new year with these changes instead of in June, which we will be working on May billing in July, working on June billing. Is that being considered?
Do you want me to take that one, Kelly?
Would you please?
Sure thing. Yep. Actually, the email communication, the important information email that was sent out, there was that question addressed. That many of these updates, so those that you see in, I think Kelly's PowerPoint had in orange and red, those activity visit tracking and anything related to that is actually going to align with the start of the new fiscal year billing. So I'm thinking about that when you start billing for July 1 and potentially entering those services starting in August. So it will align with the fiscal year. And then as far as the CCB rate table, I did catch a typo, so I apologize for that. That's on me. That it did say fiscal year 18-19, and it actually will be fiscal year 19-20. So the population of the rates will align with fiscal year 19-20, and the rate field in this new rate table is also going to be editable. So you'll still be able to enter those rates in. So anything that we feel like is going to impact, we know it's the end of the fiscal year, we'll be sending additional communication as to when you should begin using some of these pieces, and we'll have to hold off until the start of the fiscal year.
And that's on me for not catching that when I was reading off of my notes, man.
You're 18, only 19, so many 19, eyes.
I know. That's a good question too about the interpreters, and I'm going to ask Amanda for you to help me maybe try to answer that, because we are working on trying to figure out the best way to handle those contacts. They're currently being entered now by me as a service provider contact, but there's no intention at this point for interpreters to be entering anything in as far as billing goes. That would still be on the CCBs to do. Is that correct, Amanda?
Yes. And that's a good question, and I don't think I addressed that in my communication as to try to limit at least to high level. But there will be additional communication that align with certain service catalogs or different things that are entered. As an example, copay. There are some things that will still be retained as far as billing entry if you choose to use the service provider tracking in the provider portal as a billing entry responsibility of the CCB.
And another great question by Sherry, confirming that this is optional until we are comfortable on allowing providers to enter their own billing. And yes, 100%, it's optional. We again intend it to be a help lighten the burden, but we understand that with the learning curve and all that goes into these changes, it can seem very cumbersome, but it is most definitely optional. Whitney asks, will there be a point where it is not optional as far as providers entering their billing? Amanda, you can correct me if I'm off on this, but I don't think we have any, that was not part of the plan to ever roll it out to being mandatory. I think as we work with the system and CCBs try it and it works, and with providers it works, I guess that would be the tell-all as far as is it functioning as we hope that it would, but we don't have anything in our sights as far as making that mandatory. What are the stop guards in place for a provider to bill outside the scope and duration on the IFSP? Some of that I think we kind of went over with the start and end date, but I think as we get closer to being able to walk through and do a demo, it will make more sense. It's kind of hard to explain exactly, but am I correct, Amanda, that it would be more related, tied to the validations and so forth would be more tied to those start and end dates that are being entered for the providers?
Yep, so that's exactly correct. We do have validations that will align with the IFSP dates, and part of the reason we're moving in the direction of this new related list for service providers, so that you are not able to bill outside of those dates. So yep, I think it'll come together a little bit more when you see that demo, but we definitely have stop guards in place.
Is anybody excited about this? These are all great questions and points. I'm just curious if it seems like something that you feel could be positive and helpful and useful. Have you, or maybe you do already do have a few CCBs that would be beta testers for these changes before they're implemented? Yes, we do have a test group, a development and testing group, and we'll be rolling out kind of more what that phase looks like here in the coming week. Okay, that's fair enough. I think it will be helpful in the future, just not right at this moment with the end of the fiscal year around the corner. Fair enough. And I think one more point to that, as with a lot of changes and enhancements, the timeline ends up getting pushed and pushed, but I think the original idea was to roll this out earlier in the spring to give time for kind of figuring it out and working out any bugs. But yes, I see your point. And I want to give time for anybody else to ask any additional questions or provide comments, but I did want to reiterate one more time, because I did say this earlier, that the user guide is updated and on the website, and additional updates will continue to be made in the coming weeks leading up to the billing enhancement to reflect that, as well as including those links for the Lightning format and walking through the different components of the data system. And I also want to put in one more plug, just a thank you to everybody who has been using the data system form for submitting their issues, because I feel like we are at a much better place with tracking and addressing a lot of those bugs and issues, with each of you being diligent and communicating with us those needs. And we'll address next week a plan for the information and how we can even improve that system a little bit more with the information provided when it comes to submitting bugs and us being able to test and validate and get those things fixed quickly. So these changes are not yet in the guide, correct? That is correct. They are not yet in the guide. We're still in somewhat of the development phase, so all the changes are working out as we move into the testing. So once we get everything fully developed, then I'll be able to start updating the user guide. Okay, well, I believe, yep, recording the session. So once this loads, I'll post it to the EI Colorado website. And if you have any additional questions, you can certainly submit in the chatter. Any more issues that you encounter, continue as you have been doing, logging your issues through the data systems form. And thank you guys once again for taking time out of your day, and thank you for all you do. I hope everybody has a great rest of their Wednesday.